Good morning from Inver Grove Heights this morning again down in the Twin Cities area. We're going to be hitting the road for home before too much longer. There's about 6 inches of new snow here. And apologize again for last night's Ash Wednesday Lenten devotion service. I did get on finally about, 8 o'clock or a little bit after, but we spent way longer on the road than we expected anyway. Today we look at Leviticus chapter 25. And God is still giving the instructions to the Israelites as to how they should live, how they should treat each other, and the land and everything else. And chapter 25 begins with the Sabbath of the 7th year. Every 7 years they were to let the land rest idle, not to plant crops on it, not to harvest crops, that way, just so it was not only a Sabbath for the land, but also a Sabbath for the people. They could harvest crops that, just came back from seed from last year. We know there's always some of that. And they could tend their flocks and everything. And God said, I will make sure that in the 6th year, there will be sufficient grain and produce and everything to last through the 7th year and until the harvest of the 8th year again. So that you don't have to worry about, running out of food or running out of feed for the livestock or any of that. I will provide, and there will be enough, And so for every 7 years, there would be summer fallow, not of just a little bit, but of all of the land, we don't see an awful lot of summer fallow today anymore, but there's some, but I just can't imagine that we would leave the whole land, not to try to raise any crops at all. That would just be totally unheard of. But we do know that, land can recover when it's summer fallow, when it's not having to grow a crop. And there's some of the more fragile lands that's even more important on. So anyway, he's, talking about how to care for the land. And then starting in verse 8, it says, you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 70 years, plus 1 for 50. So every 50th year is the Jubilee year. And on the Jubilee year, again, it's a Sabbath. So you would have the Sabbath on the 49th year and the Jubilee on the 50th year. So there would be 2 years they wouldn't plant or, that way intentionally harvest, the whole crop. But again, God would provide. And in that 50th year, if there were any debts, if one Jewish family had to sell some land to another Jewish family, or had they sold themselves into slavery even, in that 50th year, they would be set free. And so you think, well, that could be, if somebody was did it in the 48th year, but then it says, well, if there's only 2 years left, or, if there's a few years left before the Jubilee and you sell some land, well, you don't sell it. You only sell in 2 crops worth. And then you would get your land. So it's a fair situation. Whereas if you sell something, 2 years after the Jubilee, well, then you would get, a higher price than if you sell it 2 or 3 years before the Jubilee. So it's all set up, for God that way. And if a person has, like I said, sold himself or herself or some family member into slavery, that person is then, set free as well. And all of that is protecting the Jews, protecting the land. And God says in there, you don't really own the land. The land is mine. And I thought about that with the Native Americans as the European settlers and stuff started coming in. The Native Americans didn't think they owned the land. They were living off of the land, and all of that. And it's, that's a great idea. But in today's society, the way everything is just the way everything is, I don't know how that would work out very well, if no one owned anything, the headaches. But it's still to respect the land and to know that it's God's land. that no matter if on a piece of paper it says that I own it, and it's the same, for the Jews, that on a piece of paper it said they owned this land or this house or whatever, but it's still, it was God's, and God was providing for them. And provisions for the seventh year are talked about starting in verse 18. You observe my statutes, and you will dwell in the land, and the land will yield its fruit, and you'll eat your fill and dwell in there, safely. And then the question, what will we do in the seventh year? And this is where I already mentioned that God said, the land will provide more. He said, then I will command my blessings upon you on the sixth year, and it will produce enough for 3 years. So, instead of getting 50 bushels, they're going to get 150 bushels, or instead of 15 bushels, which, I don't know what their yields were, but, Jesus talked about 30-fold or 60-fold or 100-fold. So, they knew how land could yield and stuff. Starting on verse 23 deals with that redemption of property. Talked a little bit about the land, but there's a little bit more about the houses. If you own a house, a dwelling within a walled city, you own that, and it's yours in perpetuity. And whether as if you own a land in a village where it's not walled, then it's different. But like verse 29 says, if a man sells a house in a walled city, he may redeem it within a year after it's sold, but if it's not redeemed, then it belongs permanently to the one who bought it. However, if the house or the village which has no wall is sold, they may be redeemed, but they will be released in the Jubilee year. So if you buy something that is in the walled city, no matter when it is, you don't return that during the year of the Jubilee. That remains yours. So a little bit of different laws, different interpretation here that they have to, pay attention to. Verse 35, lending to the poor. And, it's to, if someone falls among poverty, you shall help him like a stranger, or that he may live with you. And he says, don't charge them interest. That's what he says. You don't charge your fellow Jewish people interest on anything that way. And then verse 39 starts with the laws talking about slavery. And I visited a little bit about that already with, they talk about if one of your fellow Israelites is a slave, that's a different situation than if it's a foreigner who is a slave. And verse 47 says, now if a traveler or a stranger becomes rich and one of you becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or to a member of that stranger's family, after you can redeem it again. So God has set up a very specific rules of redemption, of how things work. But I think the best thing is that, God is saying, you are caretakers of my creation. And so on the seventh year, you will let the land rest, but I will make sure that you have provisions. And on the 50th year, the Jubilee year, this will be a special year set apart for the rest of the land, the rest of the people, and the restoration of property from one to another again. And it's so God is watching out for how they would treat each other and how they would be taken care of in all of those things. And, as much as, some of the chapters a little bit ago were just kind of, for me, just, really, how do I read through this, and try to keep track of it. Well, this is, a little bit more sensible in my head and a little bit easier to keep track of. But all of it is God providing a way for his people, his chosen people, to live together in harmony with one another.